The last conversations between Rob Reiner and Mel Brooks did not sound like farewells. They sounded like confessions whispered too late, words shaped by exhaustion rather than fear of death. 2 weeks before everything ended inside the Brentwood house, Rob spoke with the quiet urgency of a man who had already been living inside an ending for years. He was not speaking about fame or legacy or films. He was speaking about a weight he had carried in silence, a family tragedy that had never belonged to headlines, but had slowly hollowed out the space where certainty once lived. Mel would later say that when Rob spoke, there was no drama in his voice, no attempt to soften what he was admitting. There was only a tired clarity, the kind that comes after hope has been stretched far beyond its natural limits. Rob did not ask for advice. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply spoke as someone who needed one witness left in the world who knew the truth before it was sealed forever. What he revealed was not a single incident, not a shocking revelation, but a long, unbroken chain of choices that could no longer be undone. Hollywood learned about the tragedy through police reports and urgent headlines, but Mel understood immediately that the real story had begun long before that night. It had begun quietly, invisibly, inside the private architecture of family life, where love is not measured in gestures but in endurance. Rob told Mel that for years he had been living in a house where sleep came lightly, where every sound carried meaning, where silence itself felt dangerous. He described a fear that did not arrive suddenly but crept in slowly, disguised as concern, disguised as patience, disguised as loyalty to promises made in moments of hope. Mel listened without interrupting. He had known Rob since childhood, watched him grow from a boy following his father through studio corridors into a man trusted with stories that defined generations. Yet nothing in their shared history prepared him for the gravity of what Rob was finally willing to say. This was not a man overwhelmed by public pressure or professional failure. This was a father who had reached the limits of what love could absorb without collapsing inward. Rob spoke about guilt first. Not guilt for what had happened, but guilt for what had not been stopped. He admitted that there were moments when he sensed danger clearly, moments when instinct warned him that something inside the family had shifted beyond repair. And yet each time, love intervened. Love reframed fear as loyalty. Love transformed warning signs into tests of faith. Rob told Mel that what haunted him most was not a single mistake, but the realization that the hardest choices had been postponed again and again until no safe options remained. There was no anger in his words, only resignation. He spoke about his home not as a place of safety, but as a space filled with vigilance. He spoke about nights measured not by rest, but by listening. Doors opening, footsteps moving, silence returning. He admitted that he no longer trusted his own instincts, because acting on them would have meant abandoning the people he loved most. To leave would have been an act of self-preservation. To stay felt like the only moral choice left, even as it demanded more than he could afford to give. Mel later said that what struck him most was not Rob's fear, but his certainty. Rob did not believe the situation would resolve itself. He did not believe in sudden redemption. He believed only in staying, in enduring, in carrying the burden quietly so that others would not have to. In that sense, Rob's confession was not about despair, but about a decision already made long ago. The tragedy that followed would shock Hollywood because it violated an unspoken illusion that success protects against devastation, that wisdom arrives automatically with age, that love is always enough. But in that private conversation, those illusions had already fallen away. Rob understood that love could become dangerous when it refuses to acknowledge its own limits. He understood that silence, once chosen as protection, can turn into a prison. 2 weeks later, when the world searched for explanations, Mel Brooks already carried one inside him. Not an answer that solved anything, but a truth that explained everything. A truth shaped by years of quiet suffering, by choices made out of devotion rather than denial, by a man who loved his family so deeply that he could not find a way to save himself from that love. Rob Reiner, a name long synonymous with cinematic greatness, had a personal history full of contrasts, a tale of achievement tainted by the shadow of personal and family struggles. His childhood, though nurtured by the love and guidance of his famous father, Carl Reiner, was not without its burdens. The Reiner family was steeped in creativity, a household brimming with humor and artistic vision. Yet the pressures that come with such a legacy often weighed heavily on Rob. Born into a family that valued entertainment, he was introduced to a world where both success and failure were amplified. Rob's formative years were spent in the chaotic embrace of show business, constantly surrounded by the glimmering lights of Hollywood. Yet, despite being in the heart of one of the world's most creative industries, there was an undercurrent of loneliness that defined his early years. As a child, Rob observed the grandeur of the film industry, but also witnessed the cost of that success. Family sacrifices, personal isolation, and the tension between fame and authenticity. Carl Reiner's success as a comedian, director, and writer made him an icon. But for Rob, growing up in his shadow posed its challenges. There was an implicit expectation to follow in his father's footsteps, to carry the torch and contribute to the family's legacy. But this came with its own set of complications. The struggle to define himself apart from his father's towering presence was something Rob battled throughout his career. Though his father offered guidance and mentorship, there was always the nagging feeling of having to live up to the incredible standard Carl set. In his youth, Rob had an intrinsic understanding of the balance between the public and private lives of those in the entertainment world. He recognized early on that behind the polished exteriors, there were often lives in turmoil. Yet, despite these lessons, he found it difficult to navigate the complexities of his own existence, both as a rising star in the industry and as a person who longed for the simplicity of a grounded life. He was caught in a web of competing expectations, the allure of Hollywood fame, the pull of family ties, and the struggle to carve out an identity separate from the legacy of his parents. Rob's relationship with his own family was deeply personal and marked by love and sacrifice. He married Michelle Singer, and together they raised a family. However, Rob's personal struggles and those of his son, Nick Reiner, would become a central theme in his life. From the outside, Rob and Michelle appear to have it all: a loving family, a successful career, and the trappings of fame. Yet behind closed doors, things were far more complicated. As a father, Rob was consumed by the desire to help Nick, despite the many warning signs that something was terribly wrong. Nick, like many children of famous parents, was deeply affected by the weight of his family's legacy. But unlike his father, Nick struggled to find a place for himself in the world. The pressures of fame and the expectations placed upon him were too much to bear. Rob's efforts to help Nick were constant, but often futile. He tried everything, aiding Nick through therapy, rehab programs, and career opportunities, but the underlying issues seemed insurmountable. Perhaps the most difficult part for Rob was that he could never truly pinpoint the moment when things started to unravel. It wasn't one single event that caused a rift. Rather, it was a slow and painful process. As a parent, Rob couldn't help but believe that his son's struggles were his own fault. He questioned his every decision, wondering if there was something more he could have done to prevent Nick from falling deeper into self-destruction. Yet, the more he tried to help, the more he realized that his love, while unyielding, couldn't fix the deeper issues Nick faced. This feeling of helplessness became even more acute as Nick's behavior became more erratic. As a father, Rob felt a profound sense of duty to protect his son from the outside world, from the judgment of others, and from the harsh realities of life. But there came a point where Rob could no longer protect Nick from himself. Despite his fears, Rob refused to give up on his son, convinced that as long as Nick wasn't abandoned, there was still hope for redemption. Behind the scenes, the Reiner family struggled with unspoken tensions as the emotional toll on Rob and Michelle became more apparent. The constant attempts to fix Nick, to keep him on track, were wearing them down. But despite the strain, Rob remained determined to be there for his son. His love for Nick, however strained, remained the one thing that kept him going. Through all of this, Rob's own career flourished. His contributions to cinema were undeniable, but the personal cost of his professional success was steep. The emotional burden of being a father and husband while juggling the demands of a high-profile career left Rob with little time for himself. His health, too, began to suffer under the weight of his personal and professional lives. The toll of years spent navigating these struggles left him exhausted, yet he refused to relent. For Rob, his family was everything, and his desire to keep his son close, to help him navigate his inner turmoil, was a battle he never stopped fighting. The story of Rob Reiner, as it unfolded in the final years of his life, is one of great internal conflict, love, and inevitable tragedy. As a director, actor, and producer, Rob was celebrated in Hollywood for his iconic works in cinema, but these achievements were shadowed by the personal struggles that marked the last years of his life. It wasn't the fame or the adoration from millions that troubled Rob. It was his family, particularly his relationship with his son, Nick, and the ongoing struggle to help him navigate the difficulties that life had thrown at him. Nick's troubled past and the growing tension between father and son came to a head in the months leading up to Rob's untimely death. For years, Rob had quietly carried the weight of his son's mental health issues, drug addiction, and emotional instability. At times, Nick appeared to be on the road to recovery, but those moments were often fleeting, and with each relapse, the hope for a better future became more distant. Rob, ever the devoted father, could not let go of the belief that his love and support could fix everything, even as the evidence mounted that Nick's issues were beyond the reach of family intervention alone. It was in the weeks leading up to his death that Rob confided in his closest friends, particularly Mel Brooks, about the torment he had been carrying. In an interview that shocked many, Mel Brooks shared the painful truth that Rob had admitted to him the depth of his fears regarding his son. "I'm terrified of Nick. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm afraid of my own son," Rob had confessed. These words, spoken in quiet moments of vulnerability, reflected a father who was wrestling with the stark reality that his son was becoming a danger, not just to himself, but to those around him. The downward spiral of Nick's mental health was not a sudden occurrence. It had been a slow, agonizing process, one that Rob had witnessed with growing concern over the years. But the family had always hoped, against all odds, that things could turn around. In the past, Rob and Michelle had sent Nick to rehabilitation programs, sought therapy, and tried every possible method to help their son. Yet, as time wore on, it became increasingly clear that nothing was working. The moment of realization for Rob came one fateful night, just 2 weeks before his death. It was a time when things had gotten so bad that Rob found himself taking extreme measures in an attempt to protect himself and his family. He began locking his bedroom door at night, not because he feared for his own life, but because he was afraid of what his son might do in a moment of anger or confusion. Rob's love for Nick never wavered, but the strain of years of disappointment, heartbreak, and fear had finally worn him down. Rob, a man who had once been known for his boldness, humor, and warmth, was now facing the harsh reality that his love for his son was not enough to save him. He had spent decades as a guiding figure for others, offering wisdom, comfort, and guidance to countless people in his life, but when it came to his own son, he was powerless. This realization, one that would haunt Rob until his final moments, was a heavy burden to bear. The emotional toll on Rob and his family reached its peak during a Christmas party, just days before the tragedy. The Reiner family, once a symbol of Hollywood success and happiness, attended the event in what would be their final public appearance together. The atmosphere was charged with tension. Nick, dressed in a hoodie while everyone else was in formal attire, behaved erratically, making the guests uncomfortable. His actions created a palpable sense of unease, but it was only later that the full extent of what had been happening behind closed doors became known. A major argument broke out between Rob, Michelle, and Nick at the party, leading them to leave abruptly. The event was seen by many as a turning point, the moment when it became clear that the family could no longer pretend that everything was okay. Rob had tried so hard to shield Nick from the world, but the truth was no longer ignorable. The strain of living with a son who was spiraling out of control had taken its toll on him and his wife, and the pain of watching Nick's descent into darkness was more than they could bear. Despite all his efforts, Rob could not escape the painful realization that he had failed as a father in the most fundamental way. He had given everything to his son, but it wasn't enough. Rob knew this. He understood that his love, as deep and unconditional as it was, could not fix Nick's problems. There were moments when Rob feared for his own safety, but he never once considered abandoning his son. Instead, he clung to the hope that somehow things would get better. That hope, however, would prove to be a cruel illusion. As the months went by, Rob's health began to deteriorate. The emotional strain of dealing with his son's issues, coupled with the ongoing pressure of his career, left Rob exhausted. He found himself increasingly isolated, cut off from the world that had once embraced him. The man who had spent his life creating memorable films and bringing joy to audiences was now consumed by a personal tragedy that no one could have predicted. Despite the toll it was taking on him, Rob refused to give up on Nick. He continued to support his son, offering him opportunities in the hope that anything, would help him find his way. Rob even involved Nick in his work, believing that the structure and responsibility of a job would give his son a sense of purpose. It was a last-ditch effort to help Nick find his way back, to show him that he still had a place in the world. But once again, this too was not enough. Nick's problems continued to escalate, and Rob's hopes for his son's recovery grew dimmer with each passing day. In the days before his death, Rob and Mel Brooks shared a conversation that would forever haunt Mel's memories. Rob, in a moment of quiet vulnerability, acknowledged that his efforts to help his son had been in vain. He said that he had tried everything, but nothing had worked. The weight of those words, spoken with the clarity of someone who had come to terms with the harsh truth, was devastating. Rob knew that he could no longer protect Nick from the world, but the pain of letting go was almost too much to bear. As Rob Reiner's life unfolded in the years leading up to his death, it became clear that the true impact of his tragic story would not be measured by his cinematic achievements, but rather by the lasting consequences of the personal battles he fought in silence. The aftermath of his death left not only Hollywood in shock, but also a profound impact on the people closest to him, who now had to grapple with the heavy burden of grief and regret. The aftermath of Rob's passing wasn't just about the loss of a beloved figure in the entertainment world. It was also about the fallout from years of unresolved emotional trauma. For his family, especially his wife Michelle, the pain of losing Rob was compounded by the devastating loss of a man who had tried relentlessly, but ultimately failed, to save his son. The echoes of his struggles lingered in every corner of their home, a place that had once symbolized love and togetherness, but was now tainted by a history of fear, guilt, and unspoken regrets. For Michelle, the grief was especially profound. She had stood by Rob through everything: the career successes, the public adoration, the private struggles. But even her unshakable love for Rob could not shield her from the devastation that followed his death. She was left with the agonizing realization that, despite all the years of effort and sacrifice, their attempts to help Nick had ultimately failed. The question that lingered in her mind, and in the minds of everyone who knew the Reiner family, was how things had gone so terribly wrong. In the wake of the tragedy, Mel Brooks, a lifelong friend and confidant to Rob, found himself grappling with his own guilt. Despite the decades of friendship and shared moments, Mel admitted that he had not done enough to intervene in Rob's life when it was most needed. He had watched his friends suffer in silence for years, but he had never pushed hard enough to confront the painful truths. As Mel reflected on the events leading up to Rob's death, he realized just how much of a responsibility he bore in the unraveling of Rob's life. Mel shared how, in the final years of Rob's life, he had often warned him about the destructive effects of his unconditional love for Nick. But Rob had never been willing to accept that his son could be a danger, not just to himself, but to others as well. In his heart, Rob believed that love was the answer, that if he could just give Nick enough support, enough care, he would eventually turn things around. But the tragic truth was that love, when pushed too far, could become a form of enabling. And this was the painful lesson that Rob never had the time to fully comprehend. The guilt that Mel felt was compounded by the fact that he had been so close to Rob, and yet had not intervened when it mattered most. Mel had watched from the sidelines as Rob's family life crumbled, knowing that things were not right, but never quite knowing how to help. Mel recalled how Rob had often expressed his concerns about Nick, how he had tried to reach out for support, but had ultimately been left to navigate the storm alone. There was a pervasive sense of helplessness in Mel's voice as he spoke of the years he had spent watching his friends suffer in silence, all the while trying to balance his own professional commitments and personal life. As the news of Rob's death spread, there was an outpouring of grief from his colleagues, friends, and fans. The public's reaction was one of deep sadness, but for those who had known Rob personally, the tragedy was not just the loss of a Hollywood icon. It was the loss of a man who had tried to hold everything together, even when it was clear that the weight of his family's struggles was too much for him to bear. The impact of Rob's death also left a lasting mark on Nick. Though he was in custody, facing serious charges and unable to escape the consequences of his actions, there was a part of him that struggled with the immense guilt of knowing what his father had sacrificed for him. The knowledge that his father had tried so hard to save him, only to have it all end in tragedy, haunted Nick in ways that few could understand. He was now left with the devastating realization that he had pushed his father to the brink, that his behavior had caused the downfall of everything they had worked for. Nick was now left to deal with the consequences of his actions, but the emotional scars of his father's death would continue to haunt him for the rest of his life. For Rob's friends and family, the consequences of the tragedy were profound. They were left with the unanswered questions of what could have been done differently and the guilt of not being able to intervene sooner. The bonds that had once been so strong were now fractured, as everyone who loved Rob had to come to terms with the fact that they could never truly understand the depth of his pain. Rob's legacy, which had once been defined by his films and his career, was now tainted by the darkness that had taken over his personal life. As Mel reflected on the events leading up to Rob's death, he couldn't help but wonder if there had been a moment, a turning point, where things could have been different. But in the end, there were no answers. There were only the painful memories of a man who had given everything for his family, only to have that love become the very thing that destroyed him. Rob Reiner's story serves as a haunting reminder of the complexities of love and sacrifice and the devastating consequences of a life lived under the pressure of expectations. It is a story that challenges us to question our own relationships, to ask ourselves how far we are willing to go for the ones we love, and whether love alone is ever enough to save someone from the darkness inside. The tragedy surrounding Rob Reiner's life and death, while widely publicized, also unveiled the quiet, often unspoken struggles that had shaped his existence. Beyond the headlines and the shocking details of his final days, there were the hidden moments, those private memories that rarely saw the light of day. As with many people who struggle in silence, these moments tell a different story. They reveal a man not defined by his successes or failures, but by the quieter battles he fought within himself, and the love he had for his family that was both a gift and a burden. Rob's efforts to protect and nurture his son, Nick, were not just confined to the public sphere, nor were they always grand gestures. Often, the real story lay in the smaller, quieter acts, the late-night conversations, the unspoken gestures of support, and the sacrifices that seemed invisible to the outside world. These were the moments that defined Rob's character, even more so than the achievements that made him a household name. In his final years, Rob became a man defined not by the films he made or the accolades he received, but by the tireless, often thankless, efforts to save his son from the self-destructive path he was on. There were times when Rob's efforts were met with resistance, not just from Nick, but from those around him. His friends and family, while supportive, could see the toll it was taking on Rob, and many, including Mel Brooks, had moments of doubt. Mel, who had watched Rob grow from a young man into a successful director, knew Rob's vulnerabilities. He had seen the early signs of stress, the cracks in the facade that Rob tried so hard to maintain. But as with many loved ones caught in the throes of a complex family dynamic, Mel didn't know how to intervene without making matters worse. Rob himself was often torn between his deep desire to be a good father and the realization that his love for Nick was not enough to overcome the severe emotional and psychological challenges Nick faced. There was a constant tension between the need to protect his son and the growing fear that, by trying to protect him, Rob was inadvertently enabling his behavior. The struggle for Rob was not just about the external pressures of his career or public life. It was the internal conflict, the emotional battle that he fought daily, often alone. In the years leading up to his death, Rob had become increasingly isolated. The emotional toll of his son's struggles, compounded by the demands of his career, left him feeling worn down. At times, Rob seemed like a man on the verge of breaking, carrying a burden too heavy for any one person to bear. Yet, even in his darkest moments, he never wavered in his belief that love was the answer. He held onto the hope that, eventually, Nick would turn his life around, that the bond they shared would be strong enough to overcome the difficulties they faced. This unshakable belief in the power of love, while admirable, was also the source of Rob's greatest vulnerability. He allowed his love for his son to blind him to the reality of the situation. By refusing to acknowledge the depth of Nick's issues, Rob put his family and himself at risk. In his heart, Rob wanted to believe that, given enough time, enough care, his son would eventually find his way. But as the years passed and Nick's struggles deepened, Rob was left to grapple with the painful realization that his efforts were not enough. The final years of Rob's life were marked by a series of emotional and physical tolls that no one outside of his closest circle could fully comprehend. Rob's body, once strong and full of energy, began to show the wear and tear of a life lived in constant struggle. The stress, the worry, the heartbreak, all of it began to take its toll. But Rob never sought sympathy. He continued to push forward to care for his family and to hold onto the belief that things would eventually get better. One of the most poignant and heartbreaking aspects of Rob's final years was the way he clung to the hope that Nick would one day find peace. Despite the countless setbacks, the relapses, and the many failed attempts to help him, Rob never gave up on his son. He continued to see Nick not as the troubled young man he had become, but as the child he had once known, a child in need of guidance, love, and understanding. As the years passed and the tension between father and son grew, Rob's internal struggle became more apparent. He was caught in a vicious cycle, constantly trying to fix something that seemed beyond repair. The guilt that weighed on him, the sense of helplessness, were things that Rob kept hidden from the public eye. He never let anyone see how much he was suffering, how deeply he felt the pain of watching his son spiral out of control. But the truth was that Rob's story was not just about his efforts to save his son. It was about the quiet moments of sacrifice that defined his entire life. From the outside, Rob's success seemed to come effortlessly. He was a beloved figure in Hollywood, a man who had achieved the ultimate career goals. But behind that success was a man who was constantly battling to keep his family together, to protect his loved ones, and to preserve the life he had worked so hard to build. In the weeks before his death, Rob's struggle became even more evident. He was no longer the confident, charismatic figure he had once been. The weight of his personal life had taken its toll, and Rob's friends and family saw him for the first time as a man who was truly broken. He had fought for so long, but in the end, he had reached the point where he no longer knew how to fix things. His health was deteriorating, and his emotional state was fragile. Yet, through it all, Rob remained devoted to his family, always believing that love, in the end, would conquer all. As Rob Reiner's story reached its tragic end, the question that lingered in the minds of those who knew him was not just about what happened in his final days, but what lessons could be drawn from his life. His journey, marked by immense personal and professional success, was also characterized by a deep internal struggle, one that spoke to the complexities of love, sacrifice, and the unrelenting pursuit of redemption. But in the end, it was clear that even the most enduring love cannot always overcome the obstacles of the human condition. Rob's life and legacy are filled with contradictions. His public persona, as a successful director and beloved figure in Hollywood, stood in stark contrast to the private battles he fought within his own home. He was, by all accounts, a man who gave everything to his family. He was a dedicated father, a loving husband, and a loyal friend. But despite the love he had for his family and the sacrifices he made for them, his efforts were not enough to save his son, Nick, from the destructive forces that had taken root within him. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Rob's story is the realization that, in the end, his greatest fear had come to pass. His love for Nick, while genuine and unyielding, had become a source of pain rather than healing. Rob had spent years trying to protect Nick, trying to fix what was broken within him, but in the process, he had neglected to acknowledge the truth, that sometimes love alone cannot heal all wounds. The most poignant moments of Rob's life were those small, often unnoticed acts of sacrifice and dedication. From the outside, Rob's success in Hollywood was built on talent, charisma, and hard work. Yet, behind the scenes, Rob was carrying a burden that no one truly understood. The emotional toll of being a father to a troubled son, of carrying the weight of a family's struggles, was a constant in Rob's life. He never sought recognition for the sacrifices he made, nor did he ever ask for sympathy. He simply did what he believed was right, even when it became clear that his efforts might not be enough. In the weeks before his death, Rob came to terms with the fact that he could no longer carry the burden alone. The toll on his health, both physical and emotional, had become too great. Yet, even in the face of his own suffering, Rob never gave up on his family. His love for Nick remained unwavering, even as he began to acknowledge the painful truth that his son might never change. Rob's relationship with Nick was complex, filled with love and guilt, hope and fear. He had always seen Nick as his child, the one person he could never abandon, no matter the circumstances. Even in the darkest moments, Rob refused to give up on his son. But the price of this devotion was high. Rob spent years trying to save Nick, trying to fix the unfixable, and in doing so, he sacrificed his own peace of mind and well-being. His love for Nick, though pure and selfless, had become a trap, one that ultimately led to his own downfall. For those who knew Rob, his story is a powerful reminder of the complexities of love and the limits of personal sacrifice. While Rob's dedication to his family was admirable, it also highlights the importance of recognizing when love alone is not enough. Sometimes, the most loving thing a person can do is to let go, to accept that not all battles can be won. Rob, tragically, never reached that realization in time. His inability to let go of his son, to stop trying to fix everything, led him down a path of personal destruction. In the end, Rob was left with the painful knowledge that no matter how much he loved Nick, he couldn't protect him from the consequences of his own actions. Despite the sadness that marks Rob's story, there's also a profound lesson about the importance of resilience, forgiveness, and the complexities of family dynamics. Rob's journey reminds us that, while love is a powerful force, it is not infallible. It is not a cure-all, and it cannot always overcome the deepest of wounds. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to accept that we cannot change others, no matter how hard we try. In his final moments, Rob was a man who had fought for his family with all his strength, yet he was also a man who had come to terms with the limitations of his love. His story is one of deep tragedy, but it is also one of quiet dignity. Rob Reiner's legacy is not just defined by his cinematic contributions, but by the lessons his life offers about love, sacrifice, and the complexities of the human condition. While Rob's death left a profound emptiness, it also left behind a legacy of thoughtfulness, introspection, and resilience. Those who loved him and those who admired him for his work in Hollywood will remember him not just for the films he made, but for the man he was: a father, a friend, and a husband who gave everything he had to protect the ones he loved. Rob's story is a testament to the power of love, But it is also a reminder of the importance of recognizing when love must be tempered by acceptance and when it is time to let go. As the story of Rob Reiner comes to a close, it leaves behind a legacy of profound complexity, a mix of triumph and tragedy, of love and sacrifice, of hope and despair. While his death marked the end of a chapter in Hollywood, it also marked the beginning of a broader conversation about the limits of love and the price we pay when we push ourselves and others too far. In the quiet aftermath of his passing, Rob's life became a cautionary tale, one that forces us to confront difficult truths about our own relationships, our own choices, and the consequences of our actions. What remains as we look back on Rob's life is not just the films he directed or the characters he portrayed, but the unspoken lessons his story offers. Rob's legacy, at least in part, is one of resilience. Despite the challenges he faced, despite the moments of deep emotional pain, Rob never gave up on his family. He believed in love, his love for his son, his wife, and his friends, right up to the end. And that, in itself, is a remarkable thing. But his story also compels us to ask ourselves, how much can love endure? At what point does the weight of caring for someone become too much for one person to carry alone? Rob's story underscores the importance of knowing when to step back, when to acknowledge that our efforts, no matter how noble, might not be enough to change the course of someone else's life. In his final years, Rob came to a painful understanding that his love for Nick, while steadfast and true, could not save him. He had tried everything: therapy, rehab, work opportunities, and yet the deep scars that Nick carried remained. For Rob, this realization was excruciating, but it was also a part of his journey. A journey that taught him, and all of us, that love, when pushed beyond its natural limits, can become a source of pain rather than healing. In his final moments, Rob didn't look for redemption for himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness or sympathy. What he sought quietly was peace for his family, for his son, for his wife, Michelle, who had stood by him through it all. Rob had given everything to protect them, to shield them from the outside world, and most painfully, to protect Nick from his own demons. But in the end, he couldn't shield them from the reality of their lives. That was the hardest part. Rob's love had been his greatest strength, but it had also been his greatest weakness. Michelle, left to cope with the aftermath of Rob's death, is now left with the echoes of their years together. The grief she feels is not just for the loss of her husband, but for the loss of a man who had given his all to a son who could never truly find his place in the world. Michelle's sorrow is also colored by the bitter knowledge that, despite Rob's relentless devotion to Nick, he could not prevent the tragedy that ultimately occurred. It is the kind of grief that comes not from a sudden event, but from a long, slow realization that things were slipping out of their control, despite all their efforts. Nick's own grief is complex and filled with self-loathing. He is left with the unbearable weight of knowing that his actions, the choices he made, contributed to his father's death. The guilt that Nick feels is a heavy burden, one that will stay with him for the rest of his life. He can never undo the pain he caused, nor can he escape the reality that, despite his father's love, he ultimately became the cause of that love's destruction. Mel Brooks, too, carries the burden of loss, but his grief is tinged with a different kind of regret. As one of Rob's closest friends, Mel had witnessed the slow unraveling of Rob's family life, but he had never been able to offer the help that Rob so desperately needed. Mel's reflections on their friendship reveal the difficult truth. Sometimes, even the closest of friends cannot prevent tragedy, and sometimes, love is not enough to heal the deepest wounds. The story of Rob Reiner is one that will resonate with anyone who has ever been caught in the cycle of unconditional love. Love that endures, even in the face of unrelenting pain. Love that keeps fighting even when the outcome seems inevitable. It is a reminder that love, for all its power, is not a cure-all. It cannot fix everything, and sometimes it can cause as much harm as it prevents. Rob's life teaches us that, while we must give love freely and without hesitation, we must also know when to let go, when to stop sacrificing ourselves for others who may never change. At the heart of this story is a question that is both universal and deeply personal. What is the price of love? For Rob Reiner, the price was everything. He gave his career, his peace of mind, and ultimately his life for the sake of the people he loved. But the cost of his love was not just personal, it was familial. It affected his wife, his friends, and most tragically, his son. Rob's story is a painful reminder that, while love can be a force for good, it can also be a force that wears us down, that leads us to places we never intended to go. As we reflect on Rob Reiner's legacy, we are left with a sense of profound sadness, but also with a deep respect for the love he gave and the sacrifices he made. His story, in its sadness, is also one of strength, of resilience, and of the quiet, often unseen battles that so many of us fight in the name of love. The story of Rob Reiner is one that will not be forgotten, not because of the films he made or the fame he achieved, but because of the man he was and the love he gave.